She buried her mother 6 days before she stood in a courtroom and signed away the life she had built. The judge's gavel barely had time to cool when Michael spoke as if he were reading a verdict he'd already written. Clare had contributed nothing, he said. The room hummed with the kind of pity that cuts deeper than anger. Vanessa sat a row behind him, composed in a way that made the whole thing look planned. Clare left the courthouse hollowed, hands folded over a paper that felt more like a confession than a contract. Have you ever felt invisible to someone you loved? Tell us below if you have. They had met at a community college library where late-night study tables smelled of coffee and possibility. Clare was the one with the stack of textbooks and a notebook full of careful notes. Margaret Harrington was waiting on a bench nearby with a paper bag and a soft smile that belonged to someone who had seen storms and chosen to stand in them anyway. Michael noticed Clare because she laughed at a joke only she heard. Clare noticed Michael because he read aloud from the margins, more interested in being admired than in what was being read. It was small, ordinary moments that braided them together at first, shared rides when buses broke down, co-authored essays turned in the next morning, nights spent planning a future that felt rich. Margaret lived quietly. To the neighborhood she was modest, her house tidy, her garden trimmed, but there was a steadiness in her movements that spoke of hidden reserves. She taught Clare how to fold letters into small, precise shapes. She taught her how to listen without needing to answer. Those were lessons Clare would only understand fully much later, when she stood in boardrooms instead of back kitchens, holding the sorted pieces of someone else's design. Clare worked. She took shifts at a diner, answered phones at a small clinic, tutored math after classes. Michael, restless and ambitious, tasted the possibility of more. He launched a startup that drank time and charm in equal measure. At first, Clare sat at his kitchen table and balanced ledgers and bills with patient fingers, the couple's names elbowing their way into each other's calendars. She believed in partnership, quiet, unglamorous, everyday faithfulness. When the business began to hum with investment money and heady articles, Michael's voice leaned more often to boardroom slang than to the names of people who helped him get there. He started taking late flights, coming home with a different cologne and a story that made the apartment feel bigger and lonelier at once. Vanessa came in like a light someone else had lowered. She was precise, practiced, an expert at looking at the world as a stage where one must always be ready for applause. She attended the company parties and smiled at investors the way someone smiles at a camera. When Michael stopped calling to say where he would be for dinner, Clare's small alarm bells sounded and then quieted. She kept her days full, convinced that the life she had chosen, the one with Margaret's steady gaze in the background, was worth more than a scene. Margaret's illness arrived like a slow tide. It took reserve first, Clare's rigged schedules and double shifts, the way her hand trembled against a prescription bottle at 3 a.m. Michael called less, sent messages of concern that read like a summary written by someone skimming the margins. He missed appointments. He missed the small rituals of care. At the hospital, Clare learned to fold her exhaustion into a polite smile and to be the one who stayed on the nights when the machines whispered. Margaret, with that same quiet clarity, would sometimes reach for Clare's hand and say, "You have more strength than you think." Clare would laugh and say she had nothing special. Margaret would only squeeze and refuse the argument. Those moments at the bedside built a private scaffolding around Clare, a foundation she didn't know she'd need. The funeral was unadorned and honest. Friends who were more friends than family sat close. A few faces from old neighborhoods, the cafeteria woman who had always given Margaret a discount on pies, a tutor who nodded as if she had stepped into a book she loved. Michael did not come. His absence was a bruise, and Vanessa sent flowers anyway, an arrangement too perfectly coordinated to be sincere. The smallness of the ceremony amplified everything. The air, the quiet footsteps, Clare's folded hands. She signed papers she barely read because grief makes your world narrow. Then, 3 days later, the divorce papers landed on her kitchen table like a final, formal absence. In court, Michael performed a sort of economy of cruelty. He recited emails as if their marriage were merely an itemized ledger. He spoke of sacrifices he had supposedly made and of a woman who had not contributed in measurable ways. The reporters' pens scratched at the margins. People leaned forward the way they lean in to gossip. Clare listened mostly through a kind of fog, the words dissolving into the hum of the ventilation system. She signed what she was asked to sign, not from strategy, but because grief had made everything heavy, and she had mistaken surrender for survival. But that surrender was not the end of the story. It was, in truth, the beginning of something that no one in that courtroom could have guessed. 3 days after the divorce was finalized, an international number flashed across Claire's phone. The voice on the other end was measured, Swiss precise, offering condolences before the logistics, documents, a will, a strange insistence on certified papers, and a meeting in Zurich. Andreas Keller introduced himself as an attorney with a firm that handled affairs for clients who preferred their lives quiet and their assets quieter. He spoke in calm sentences and used a last name Harrington that Clare immediately remembered. Her mother's quiet life had had corners no one in their small town knew how to occupy. Claire's stomach fell away. At first, she thought it a mistake. There must be an executor somewhere who had mixed up names. But the paperwork arrived in envelopes that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. There were ledgers and corporate structures and trustee memos that mentioned companies Clare had never heard of, and a notation that Clare Harrington was the sole beneficiary of a trust designed to outlast lifetimes. There, in the dry language of legal documents, a number was quoted as reported value. A figure so enormous, it felt like fiction, almost $1.7 trillion. As the document stated, shock is many things. In Clare, it was a pressure behind the eyes, and an odd, ridiculous laughter in the living room where she had once made mac and cheese over a radio. It was also an anger that had nothing to do with money. It was the realization that someone had been keeping entire worlds from her. That the woman who had taught her how to fold letters and listen had built an empire in silence. Margaret had kept her modesty like a cloak. Now that cloak fell away and beneath it was a map. The next morning Clare booked the first flight she could afford and flew to Zurich. The city opened around her in glass and efficiency. Snow framed the Alps like a distant promise. The law firm where Andreas worked had a waiting area that smelled of polished stone and neutral coffee. Engineers of discretion led meetings where terms such as trustee structure and legacy stewardship were spoken in plain English, explained gently, and without the spectacle Clare had imagined. She was not asked to perform. She was asked to listen. The learning that followed was not instantaneous. There were nights when numbers and charts swam like foreign script. There were moments she wanted to throw up her hands and run back to her kitchen table where bills were simple and meals predictable. But Margaret had not raised a woman to run when things got hard. She taught Clare how to take small, careful steps. She taught her to ask questions until answers became comprehensible. Clare spent weeks meeting with advisors who translated corporate holdings into a language of purpose and risk. She learned the names of subsidiaries and charitable vehicles, and she learned that power without a plan can be clumsy. She insisted on understanding the bones of what she had inherited, not to weaponize it, but to steward it. In the months that followed, Clare's transformation felt less like a metamorphosis and more like a slow, sure deepening. She took classes on leadership and finance, basic ones, nothing flashy, so she could hold her head in meetings without being talked around. She hired a small, loyal team who treated her with the same reverence she'd watched her mother receive, not starstruck, but protective. Her advisors were clear. This was not theater. There were reputations at stake, investors to reassure, employees whose livelihoods balanced on public confidence. Clare refused needless spectacle. She was not looking for revenge. She was looking for a way to make sure the values she'd been raised with discretion. Longview had the capacity to do tangible good. Meanwhile, Michael's life went on in the way a glass ornament continues to spin after it is nudged. Elegant in motion, fragile by definition. He continued to be described at industry events as a visionary, and Vanessa continued to be the image of polished entitlement. But the world of investment trembles when confidence does. Small coups missed quarterly can provoke larger ripples. Investors begin to ask questions out of caution, out of fiduciary responsibility, out of the simple human love of not losing what they think they have gained. Claire's approach was deliberately quiet. She began buying into influence through legitimate channels, shares not as weapons, but as claims on the future of companies that had once been more about image than substance. She made offers that were professional and above, always with eyes on the long-term health of the businesses involved, and always consulting with the fiduciaries who managed her mother's trusts. There was no shouting in press rooms, no banners in front of the courthouse. Her moves were like carefully placed stones across a river, practical, meant to allow passage rather than to drown those who might have slipped. When the time came for confrontation, it was not staged as a spectacle. An investor meeting was called in a glass-walled boardroom that looked out over a city that had learned to make its winters seem like a promise rather than a threat. Michael had been invited as a courtesy. The investor group wanted clarity, a face to a story that had become muddied by rumor. Claire entered quietly. She had learned the names of the people in the room and the essentials of the business they were there to protect. She sat, and the room paused. It mattered how she carried herself. She did not stand at a podium and declare war. Instead, she produced documents, votes confirmed, share positions validated, legal rights exercised in the manner professionals use to keep commerce functioning. Michael's face went through the stages of disbelief. Amused, annoyed, then something precariously close to panic. He realized, perhaps before he wanted to, that the control he thought he had cultivated was conditional. Claire gave him a moment to speak, to begin the old dance of charm, but she did not let nostalgia tether her to what had been. She offered a measured path, a resignation framed as a professional necessity, a transfer of power framed as a protection of company continuity. He took 5 minutes to collect himself. The minutes stretched like a careful film, watched by investors whose patience had limits. When he left the room, it was not with the swagger of a man who believed he had won, nor with the shredded dignity of a man destroyed in public. It was with the complicated silence of a person who had underestimated both the quietness and the competence of the woman he had abandoned. In the aftermath, there were practicalities to attend 2 new leadership appointments, communications to employees, assurances to investors. Vanessa retreated from public life with a silence that suggested choices had consequences. Michael's world contracted in ways that left him to reckon with reputation and reflection. Claire, for her part, refused to gloat. There was nothing to be gained by public humiliation. The victory, such as it was moral and managerial. She had reclaimed agency, not to punish, but to realign resources toward a purpose she could believe in. She set up funds in Margaret's name, designed around the quiet things her mother had cared about: local scholarships, support for caregivers, community medical research that could transform small hospitals into anchors for rural areas. Claire put people at the center of financial decisions: education, shelter, health. It is one thing to inherit money, it is another to use it to make lives steadier. She appointed oversight committees and invited the very communities that had sustained her and her mother to have a voice in dispersed grant decisions. She disliked spectacle, but she did not shrink from accountability. Margaret's name became a shorthand for responsibility. Months blurred into a year. On the anniversary of the funeral, Claire returned to the small cemetery where Margaret lay under a stone that read simply, Margaret Harrington Stepp. She stood alone, the wind pressing its quiet in her ears, and placed a hand on the cool granite. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she spoke aloud, not to summon miracles, but to name the truth she had learned. That visibility can be quiet. That power need not be loud to matter. That dignity is not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. What you taught me, she said into the space, was how to be unseen and useful. I promised to make it count. People sometimes ask if she felt vindicated. She would say, yes, and also, no. There was a satisfaction in seeing the world acknowledge what she had always done. The unpaid nights, the held-together home, the modest acts that add up. But the deeper satisfaction was not retribution. It was stewardship. She understood finally that the truest revenge against humiliation is to become generous in ways that remove the need for spectacle. Money can be a hammer or a bridge. Claire chose bridge. Her public statements were few. When asked about her mother's legacy, she spoke of quiet commitments. My mother believed that small things matter. We will invest in those small things until they are not small anymore. Journalists tried to tug her into the theatrics. She'd been offered the temptation to narrate betrayal into a tidy morality play, but She deflected interviews that smelled of since. Her team crafted announcements that prioritized beneficiaries over backstory. The narrative shifted from scandal to service. There were costs. The divorce left scars that did not vanish with a corporate filing or a philanthropic check. Trust, once broken, does not mend in the quiet of an email. Claire learned new ways of building relationships, ones that honored boundaries and mutual respect. She learned to say no to invitations that seemed driven by curiosity about her life rather than by any shared mission. She learned to love again slowly, with people whose codes of integrity matched her own. In quiet moments, late at night, when the city hummed miles away and the house Margaret once tended was quieter than it had been in years, Claire would look at a folded letter her mother had left, none of them grand. A few lines of advice, a recipe, a folded piece of paper with a phone number for a structural engineer. Margaret had given directions in a way people give when they trust you to carry on. Small, practical cues intended to ensure continuity. Claire kept that paper in a desk drawer, not as a talisman, but as a reminder of steadiness. What defined her leadership was not the size of the balance sheet that bore her mother's name. It was the choices she made, when no one was looking, to fund shelters in neighborhoods she had known as a child, to set aside grants for students who worked nights and studied in libraries, to seed research projects in small hospitals that otherwise would wait for attention they might never receive. Those were not glamorous decisions. They were the kind that compound over time in human lives. And she remained oddly modest about the reported figure attached to her inheritance. It was quoted in documents and whispered in news cycles, as if the number could explain everything. Claire treated it as an odd footnote, something that drew attention but did not determine the work. The number is less important than the people, she would tell her new board. We steward the lives behind the numbers, not the numbers themselves. 6 months after the divorce, in a private gathering meant to reassure employees and stakeholders, a question rose from someone who had watched the public arc. Why didn't you make a scene? Why not something dramatic? Claire answered without flourish. Because spectacle is temporary, she said, service is lasting. The room held that answer, and some left with a new sense of what leadership could be. There was a moral lesson threaded through everything she did. Visibility and power do not require theatrical revenge. The kind of justice she pursued was strategic and restrained. She did not seek to humiliate, but to protect. She did not want to destroy Michael's life. She wanted to make sure that a broken marriage did not become the source of harm to people who relied on the companies he had built. Her restraint, in a way, was also a rebuke to the idea that pain must be repaid in kind. Not everyone understood. Some said she was too soft, that she had bestowed mercy where outrage might have felt just. Others admired the discipline. A woman who had been ridiculed in court and who responded not with a cry for retribution, but with the long work of building institutions that outlasted headlines. Claire's quietness became a strategy not for concealment, but for endurance. On a spring morning, years later, Claire walked through a community center funded by a program she had started. Children hopped across a new tiled floor. Teachers greeted her as if she were part of the furniture present. Necessary, unassuming. She watched a young woman sign up for night classes, the same kind of classes she had once taken with Margaret at the community college library. Something in that loop closed with a sweetness that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with continuity. People will always ask what they might do in her place. Would you fight in public? Would you wade into spectacle and drag every humiliation into the light? Or would you, instead, choose to build quietly and with purpose? Claire's choice was not about absolving pain. It was about reshaping it. She did not pretend to be without bitterness. She felt it like a memory of cold, but she used it to measure compassion, to calibrate decisions that favored healing over headline. When she visited her mother's grave one final time, she did not seek vindication there. She sought a promise to keep stewarding the small things until they were no longer small. If this story touches something inside you, if you have ever been invisible, dismissed, or underestimated, share it with someone who needs to hear that quiet strength is real and that dignity can be reclaimed without spectacle. If you want more stories like this, consider subscribing and tell us, would you choose the quiet long game Or would you stand in the spotlight and fight? Your answer might tell you more about yourself than you realize.